How's it going, Franco?
Hey, Corey, I'm doing pretty good, man. I'm not $80,000 on in-flight catering good, but I'm doing pretty good.
Yeah, I saw. Oh, that's right. Actually, I should have corrected that. They brought it down. They claim now that it was only $80,000 for
Only.
the catering on the flight, rather than 93,000. Right?
Well, Corey, this is ridiculous. I mean, the government is off by $13,000. So first, let's just start with the tab. I mean, now they're saying it's $80,000 on in-flight catering. I mean, that is a huge tab in and of itself. But hold on a second here. Originally, they said 93,000. Now they're saying 80,000. Corey, I'm saying I don't trust you. Show us the receipts. Let's see exactly what the receipts say. Let's see exactly what was spent because Corey, how in the world is the Governor General and her fellow passengers even managing to spend $80,000 on in-flight catering? And if they're spending that much on in-flight catering, how much are they actually spending once they get to the destinations on things like food, hotel, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, and this was only, just to clarify for people too, 29 people on this flight. We're not talking a big 747 that, well, it probably was a big plane, but it didn't have 400, 500 people on there. Man, you got to work pretty hard to consume that much on a flight or a couple of flights.
We broke down the numbers. You want to know what you could buy for $80,000? 22 pounds of beluga caviar or 1,100 orders of filet mignon and lobster tail from the steak. Or get this one, Corey. This one might reminisce a little bit more with you. 6,800 Big Mac meals from McDonald's. So you could buy a ton with $80,000. Really, this is why we need to see the receipts. What did you actually spend the money on? We need to see a full detailed list of the receipts. And as I said earlier, Corey, it's not just about the in-flight catering anymore. I think $80,000 warrants a full shining of the light to see what the total bill for this trip costs.
Well, absolutely. Yeah, that's just the one portion of it. I mean, what was it? This was something in my earlier rant I brought up with Adrienne Clarkson and her $5 million tour of Arctic countries 20 years ago or 15 years ago or so. It got everybody worked up. But it seems we just forget about these things with these governors general. And as Claudette, one of our commenters, pointing, is that the amount with alcohol? Well, we don't know because they haven't broken it down yet. But I imagine there's some nice single malt scotches mixed among there and some things.
Corey, you think there was more stuff spent on than just pretzels? How could that be true, right? But unfortunately, I think you're really hitting the nail on the head. This is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Governor General waste, right? We know that there's this expense program that all former governors general are entitled to that allows them to expense taxpayers for more than $200,000 every single year for the rest of their life, and up to 6 months after their death, their estate can still continue to bill taxpayers. Again, this is for former governor generals, so after they retire, they're still able to expense taxpayers. And perhaps what is so frustrating about this is that Trudeau knows that this program exists. He spent $20,000 reviewing this program. The review was done in 2019, and since then, he's just sat on his hands. He hasn't done anything about it.
Well, I mean, that's a good one to point out. I mean, just how insane this is. They can reach out from the grave and posthumously screw the taxpayers for even 6 months after they stop drawing breath. They still manage to hoop us for as much as $100,000.
Yeah, and I got another one for you. The expense account is bad. This one could be even worse. I don't know. Maybe we'll have to arm wrestle about it. But it's the pensions that these governors general get. We call it the Julie Payette pension problem because a governor general is eligible for the full taxpayer pension regardless of how long they serve. So you have the example of former Governor General Julie Payette, who served for a little bit more than 3 years, but she is still eligible to collect an estimated $4 million through the pension if she continues to collect it to the age of 90. So served for a few years, and she could still be eligible to collect millions and millions of dollars through her pension. Corey, there are 5 former governors general that are still living. If they all continue to collect the pension to age 90, for 5 of them, it'll cost taxpayers over $18 million.
Well, I guess maybe in some ways they'll save us some money if they're eating a lot of really, butter-filled, high-fat food and drinking a lot of that high-end scotch and champagne on the flights, and they won't live as long due to the unhealthy living and won't cost us as much. I mean, I know I'm joking, but it's just
I knew you were going there.
For what's getting paid for ceremonial positions by people. And Justin Trudeau so recently having, I mean, basically embarrassed himself with the Payette catastrophe. I mean, as a governor general, she went out in scandal. You'd think he'd be more careful, or the next governor general would be more careful to try and avoid this sort of thing. And she hasn't even made it a year yet. And here we go.
Yeah, that was a really good point right there that you ended on, right? We just had a very turbulent relationship with the last governor general. We were hoping for perhaps a new relationship with this governor general, but she's off to a bad start when it comes to disrespecting taxpayers' hard-earned money. You know, there's a few more points that I think we have to talk about, specifically with the $80,000 on in-flight catering. Number one, that happened in March of this year. Okay, so that happened while Canadians were experiencing a 3 decades high inflation. So you have Canadians at home who are having a difficult time fueling up their cars on the way to work, who are having a difficult time trying to afford to put ground beef in their grocery carts, all while our apparent head of state, the governor general, and her entourage are racking up $80,000 in in-flight catering. But here's a second thing that we have to remember, Corey. You know, I travel a lot with work. And it is reasonable that when you're on the road that you can expense your employer for reasonable types of meals, right? If you're on the road, you should be able to expense your employer for a reasonable meal, but not $80,000 on in-flight catering for yourself, your entourage, and whoever might be on the flight. I mean, we have to remember too, is that the governor general, she is making more than $300,000 in her annual salary. So if she wants to have a fancy meal, by all means, she should be able to pay for it out of pocket.
Yeah, they're not starving. And I mean, I said that kind of earlier in my rant. I understand. Okay, they don't necessarily have to endure just going through a whole flight with a pack of peanuts and a water bottle. But I mean, that's just beyond the pale when it's getting to those levels. I don't know what it'll take to fix it, but I'm glad you guys keep exposing it. Getting on to maybe pivoting a bit, though, another big issue this week, and I'm sure you guys have been on, is the inflation effort that Chrystia Freeland is doing. It's just, wow. Is that they don't even know basic economic theory, do they? Or did they just not care?
Well, that is the $1 trillion question, isn't it, Corey? Now, before I get into the inflation announcement, I just want to talk about the irony listening to the finance minister talking about so-called fiscal restraint from the government when the governor general is under a scandal for expensing $80,000 on in-flight catering. Do you see the irony there, where you have the finance minister talking about fiscal restraint and then the governor general and her entourage milking taxpayers on in-flight catering? But Corey, let's talk about the substance. $8.9 billion is this so-called plan to help improve the cost of living. Well, you have Freeland who's talking about affordability, but Canadians are having a tough time fueling up their cars, filling up their grocery carts, because this government has been spending like crazy for years and raising taxes. And what is this government doing lately? Well, it just raises carbon tax for the third time during COVID-19. It just raised alcohol taxes for the third time during the pandemic. It's raising payroll taxes again this year. And now we are seeing more and more spending. So what is causing this inflation, the government is just doubling down on. So Corey, it's almost like Freeland is trying to put out this inflation fire by dumping gasoline all over it.
Yeah, and again, as I said, you know, I mean, not everybody reads up on economics. It's a bit dry, but some of the most basic principles. I mean, it applies to currencies even. It's supply and demand. If you borrow, it means you got to increase the supply. If government does, I mean, they've got to crank out the currency, flood the market with it. It becomes worth less, and then you get inflation. I mean, this is just the basics of economics. A finance minister should be well aware of this. Yet,
well, the more dollars the government's Bank of Canada prints, the less that your dollars in your bank account or your savings account will buy. And the Bank of Canada has had its printing press on overdrive during the pandemic. It printed more than $300 billion, Corey, right out of thin air. And what do you think happens when you print $300 billion out of thin air and drop it right into the economy when you have the government locking people down and paying people not to work? What happens is that you create the perfect storm for inflation, where you have too many dollars chasing too few goods. That is exactly what the government of Canada has done, creating the perfect storm for inflation. And now Freeland is really adding more fuel to the inflation fire with more spending, with more debt. Well, how are we going to finance all of this spending? How are we going to pay down all this debt? What we need to see the government do is to stop what it has been doing, which is creating this inflation, right? Rein in the years of overspending, chip away at the $1 trillion debt. And for heaven's sake, give taxpayers some much needed relief.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's, fighting inflation by borrowing almost $9 billion. It's like fighting weight gain by doubling the amount of ice cream you eat every month. It's just not going to work. Your strategy is rather stupid, to be honest. But that seems to be all they know how to do.
Well, you're right. It seems like this government's only plan is just to spend buckets of taxpayers' cash. When times are tough, they spend a ton of money. When times are good before the pandemic, they spend a ton of money. When the economy is inflating, what do? You guessed it, they spend a ton of money. This is the only so-called plan that we have heard from this Trudeau government. But let's just look at the history here, right? We saw Trudeau back in, I think, 2014, the budget would balance itself. Well, I mean, still waiting on that, just checking my watch. We heard in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he would balance the budget by 2019. He missed that target by a country mile before the pandemic. Now, the books say that we wouldn't get a balanced budget until 2070 under the current trajectory. So this spend, deficit, it's not working. It's one of the reasons that we're seeing this 3 decades high inflation. And we really need to see this government reverse its course, or Canadians are going to continue to get gouged in just the cost of living going up.
Yeah, well, with that latest plan, let's see. So if I manage to make it to the age of 99, I might actually see a balanced budget in Canada, assuming they hold the course where they are right now.
Yeah, and assuming you don't double down on those ice creams too, Corey.
So there's just been no discussion whatsoever of cutting anything, though, has there? I mean, they talk about everybody else tightening their belts. They talk about how it's tough times, but there's nowhere where they've trimmed, is there?
Oh, no. What we've seen from this government is essentially spend more money on everything forever. Now, we hear a lot of people say, well, we just had a pandemic. Didn't the government have to increase spending the way it did? Well, I think we can all arm wrestle on the specifics, but let's take a high level view here. When you have a family, when you have a business that is going through tough times, families and businesses understand that, okay, redirect resources, maybe spend more money on one area of the budget, but cut back on other areas of the budget. That is the approach that the federal government should have taken. That is not what the federal government did. We didn't see any prioritization. We just saw more and more and more spending. Now, fast forward to today, the government wants to spend about $450 billion this year. That's $90 billion more than it was spending pre-pandemic. And here's why that matters. Before the pandemic, the Trudeau government was spending all-time highs. Meaning in 2018, the Trudeau government spent more money than the federal government did during any single year during World War II, even after accounting for inflation and population differences. So before the pandemic, you had the government spending all-time highs. Now the government wants to spend $90 billion more than that. And the finance minister somehow has the audacity to tell Canadians that the government is bringing in fiscal restraint. What fiscal restraint? By all measures, we have not seen any fiscal restraint from this government yet.
Well, all we can do is keep pushing on them. Hopefully some of the wiser minds, quiet, hiding in the background of the Liberal Party, start speaking up maybe and change some things, and I guess keep the pressure on. So, before we close, where can people find more information on what you guys are up to and what you're doing? I mean, maybe you'll finally get the breakdown of what happened on that flight and share it somewhere.
Oh, we definitely, we're going to keep snooping around for that. We've already filed in the ATIPs, the Freedom of Information request, to get the actual breakdown. But please head over to taxpayer.com, check out our newsroom tab where you can find all of our articles. We've got a bunch of great petitions that you can sign there. Of course, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, just search Canadian Taxpayers Federation.
Great. Well, always good to have you on, Franco. I appreciate the work and sharing that with us, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Corey, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.